directed a discussion of how to reap political advantage from the aftermath according to the agenda for the date. As the consultant saw it, Clinton's handling of the tragedy would lead to temporary gain, boost in ratings, and how he could create a permanent possible gain. Sets up extremist issue versus Republican. This talks about this in his book Behind the Oval Office, a new edition of it that has an appendix area with all this information in it that wasn't included earlier. Well, we're going to move on to foreign affairs issues now. Two guests joining us. We'll be back in just a minute. We're back and we're going to discuss foreign affairs issues for the next hour and a half. Morton Halperin, the Director of Policy Planning Staff at the State Department. How big is this story, for the front page story in the Los Angeles Times and so many of the others, that there's going to be the dissolving of the parliament in Israel?
Well, I think it's an important story. It means, unfortunately, that there's going to be a delay in the peace process, but it also means that there will be a debate in Israel about which direction they want to move forward in. And the hope is that out of this election will come a renewed commitment to the peace process that will enable us to move forward.
And how does it affect us?
Well, it produces an unfortunate delay in the peace process, and the danger is that that the Palestinians will become impatient during this period and that there could be a further deterioration in the process.
Mr. Wolfowitz, what about you? What do you think?
Well, it'd be nice to see this happen in other countries in the Middle East. I think we'll make a lot more progress on peace when they all have democratic debates about policy, and I think basically it's a very healthy thing that there will be, I think now, a very substantial debate in Israel, and I hope it'll, as Mr. Halperin said, I hope it'll be a debate that puts greater commitment to the idea that I think Israel's long-term security lies in a peace with the Palestinians.
Are there other candidates we should watch for, people who are not household names in the United States?
Well, the former Chief of Staff of the Army, Amnon Shahak, is with a number of people forming a new party, which some people expect may actually change the face of Israeli politics substantially.
I think I have a
It may or may not. We'll have to wait and see.
Who is he?
He is actually, I think, his great-great-grandparents actually lived in Jerusalem, which makes him probably one of the oldest, in terms of genealogy, oldest Israeli families. He was a very decorated war hero. He was Chief of Staff of the Army. As Yitzhak Rabin and others have demonstrated, there's a tradition in Israel of former generals going into politics. I guess we've had that in this country also.
Now, I know we said we were going to talk this hour and a half about looking back, but already some of the papers are looking forward in foreign affairs. And I wanted to get your reaction to this one in the Christian Science Monitor. A little piece that talks about the 10 most serious areas of conflict and political instability in the world next year. This is according to World Vision. Are either of you familiar with that organization?
Slightly, yes.
It says it's a relief and development organization, and it names the 10 countries. Here they are, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Number 1, Angola. Number 2, the Balkans. Number 3, Central Africa. Number 4, Colombia. Number 5, Ethiopia. Number 6, India. Pakistan, it says. Number 7, Indonesia. Then Iraq. Then North Korea. And then the Sudan. Now, what it doesn't say here is whether they're in any order, so I don't know. That's the order they put them in. Any surprises there?
I think it reflects a reasonable priority from World Vision. These are almost all cases, I guess India, Pakistan is a slightly different one, of major humanitarian disasters. And even Iraq and North Korea, which present major issues from the danger of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, also you have regimes, dictatorial regimes, that happen to be starving their own people. And I think the focus of World Vision is on the people that are going to be hungering and suffering because of world events. At the same time, I think if you made a different list, you'd have a different set of countries that are also disturbing. Some of these would make it India, Pakistan, Iraq, North Korea, that represent a disturbing trend toward medium-sized powers acquiring weapons that used to belong only to the superpowers.
Mr. Halperin, if you had to name one country that concerns you the most for the next year, what would it be?
Well, I think the most serious immediate threat we face is from Iraq, and the problem of getting the sanctions to continue, getting the inspection back in place.
And what happens now that people are home? There's a story this morning saying that France would like to find another alternative to UNSCOM. What happens now?
Well, I think there'll be debates in the Security Council, because the sanctions can only be lifted by an affirmative vote of the Security Council, which includes the United States, and therefore there will have to be negotiations. The Russians and the French, I think, are anxious to try to move towards the ending of sanctions. We're determined that there will be inspections and sanctions until we are satisfied that all the weapons of mass destruction have been removed. So there will have to be negotiations to try to get UNSCOM back, to get it to do effective inspections so that we can move forward.
Mr. Wolfowitz, did you have any problems with what the administration did in the past several weeks?
Well, I have problems with what they've done for the past 26 months. I think they let this crisis build and build and build, and when it finally came, they should have dealt with it much sooner. When they finally dealt with it, I think this military action is going to turn out to be very short-lived in its effects, and unless there's a change in policy, and sometimes they sound as though there will be a change in policy, toward recognizing that Saddam Hussein is the problem and we need to work on helping the Iraqi people get him off their backs. If that's happening, then it will turn out to have been a decisive turn. Alternatively, I think if that doesn't happen, we're going to see a collapse of American policy.
Is there a change of policy on the offense?
No, I think there's... we've made it clear that we think there cannot be any ultimate solution until there is a new government in Iraq. At the same time, we need to deal with the reality of the views of other countries and work in a way that maintains the sanctions, that continues to put pressure on the regime so that they will accept effective inspections. So I think we're on a two-track policy. On the one hand, we made it clear that over the long run, we think stability will come only with a new government, and in the short run, that we're determined to keep the sanctions in place and to get the inspectors back in.
But that's the policy of just sitting back and waiting for something to happen. To really do something about overthrowing Saddam Hussein, the United States has to make it clear that it's prepared to take serious action. It can be a death sentence to oppose Saddam Hussein inside Iraq, and people aren't going to do it unless they're assured of some serious support from the United States.
We're going to get to your phone calls in just a minute. Let me introduce you to these two gentlemen so you have a little bit of background on them. Mr. Halperin is director of the policy planning staff at the State Department, and that's a fairly new post for you.
Yes, it is. I've been there just a few weeks.
What does it do?
It was actually created by General Marshall when he was Secretary of State to provide in the State Department the same kind of long-range planning that the military have always had, and our job is to provide advice to the Secretary about the long-run implications of our policies.
How many people on your staff?
There are about 12 professionals.
And is it worldwide? Do they have to deal with all issues?
Well, we have a mandate to deal with all issues. We try to pick those issues which we think are critical and which require some long-range thinking.
Now, you have a background in many other administrations. The Nixon administration, what did you do?
I was on the National Security Council staff and actually ran a policy planning staff on the National Security Council staff.
And in the Johnson administration?
I was in the Pentagon, where I ran a policy planning staff in the Pentagon.
And what were you doing immediately prior to coming to the State Department several weeks ago?
I was the senior vice president at the Century Foundation, which used to be called the 20th Century Fund, which is a think tank.
We have 2 New York natives here. I didn't realize that.
Almost everybody's in here.
Brooklyn and Ithaca, right? You come to this as Dean of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. What is it?
It's a graduate school, mostly professional students heading into professional careers in international affairs. We have about 500 students. We have 3 campuses, and I always have to explain, because Johns Hopkins University, which is a great university, most of which is in Baltimore, our 3 locations are Washington, D.C., Bologna, Italy, and Nanjing, China. So we are all over the world, and I commute to Baltimore a lot to meet with the president and the university officials. It's a great school.
Former U.S. ambassador to Indonesia, which was on that list.
Correct.
Right? Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Bush administration, and did you work in any other administration besides the Bush administration?
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, I had Morton Halperin's job in the Reagan administration, and then became Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs. And
so you two have crossed over the years many
quite
a
lot,
time.
yeah. And I was, going back in the 70s, I was in the Pentagon in the Carter administration, and the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in the Nixon administration.
Mr. Wolfowitz has a Ph.D. in political science from the University of Chicago. Mr. Halperin has a bachelor's degree from Columbia University and a doctorate from Yale, correct? Let's get to the phones. Oro Valley, Arizona, your first call. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a couple of questions here for your panels.
Go ahead.
My first one is being from Oro Valley, we've had a recall on our mayor for the last 3 mayors. Our city doesn't even know what's going on. Now, we have a president that's being impeached. Now, what's this looking like to people like, say, Saddam Hussein? My second question, more or less, goes like this. As far as France and everyone else is concerned that's on the other side of this against us, against what we've done against Saddam Hussein, you can look back to World War II if you want to go back that far back, where France is concerned, between de Gaulle and Patton. I mean, de Gaulle always wanted the headlines where he wanted Patton sitting in the background. Well, this is something I think France is like, oh, shit, well, we didn't get the head start on this, so we don't like it.
Mr. Wolfowitz.
Well, let me take the second part first. The French are a difficult ally. When they're really on your side, it's wonderful. I think they do enjoy finding some way to find fault with the United States. In the case of Iraq, I'm afraid it's more fundamental. I think they've decided that Saddam Hussein is ultimately going to win. Iraq is one of the great oil bonanzas left in the world, and the French are lining up to do oil contracts with Saddam Hussein. I think, in fact, if the United States would make it clear that our goal is to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and sooner rather than later, I think you'd find the French lining up with whoever the next government's going to be. As to the problem of disarray and miscalculation, I guess for one thing, Saddam Hussein has a record of miscalculating whether we have a strong president or a weak one. It is unfortunately the case that the procedures of democracy completely confuse dictators in the world, and frequently they judge as weakness something that is, I think, our fundamental strength. But in the long run, and actually in the case of Iraq, it could be in a much shorter run, I think they learn that we are a very, very strong country, and that when there's a real problem to deal with abroad, the American people find a way to come together.
Mr. Halperin, to you. Especially that first question regarding how we look around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we do have, as Paul says, a tradition of rallying around. Unfortunately, in the opening moments of the military action against Iraq, there was a falling away from that. And some Republican leaders in the Congress were suggesting that they could not support the action, that they thought it was influenced by the president's domestic concerns. I think it became clear to the Congress, as they got briefings not only from the White House but from the Pentagon and from the intelligence community, that that was not the case at all, and you saw a rallying around and an assertion that this was something that was being done in our national interest, and that therefore the dispute about that should be limited. But I think the opening statements were very unfortunate.
Oakwood, Georgia, on the conservative line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN.
Welcome.
Gentlemen, one thing I've noticed, every time Bill Clinton goes to some country, he offers money. I would like to know what the sum total of all the promises that he's made to these foreign countries has been in the last 6 years.
Mr. Halperin.
Not very much. We spend less than 1% of the budget on what's called foreign aid, on assistance to other countries. That's a very modest sum. I believe we should be spending a great deal more. So the problem, in my view, is not that we spend too much money in pursuit of our interests abroad, but that we don't spend enough.
Has it changed much than in previous administrations?
I think there's been a long-term downward trend, but the situation's basically the way it's been. One thing I would emphasize, it's not as though this is just charity or just, as people like to say, giveaways. To take, for example, the enormous economic crisis going on in Asia today, I believe America's interests are at stake there, too. It's not clear how we can help, but if we can help those people get their economies to recover, I think we substantially increase the chances that we'll be able to continue the spectacular growth that we've undertaken.
Which country gets the most foreign aid?
Israel, by far.
And how much?
Followed by Egypt. I don't have the numbers in my head, but it's a substantial amount. And, of course, Congress has just increased the aid to Israel and to the Palestinians as part of the Y agreement.
Wilbert in Oklahoma on the Liberal line. Good morning.
Yes. I have a question for Mr. Halperin there. I just wonder, why do we go carpet bomb the entire country of Iraq when Saddam's a problem? Why don't we send special forces over there to take care of them?
Well, we didn't carpet bomb the whole country. The bombing was carefully targeted to get at targets that both related to the weapons of mass destruction, but also to his control of the society, and they were carefully limited to limit civilian damage, and in that regard they seem to have been very successful. There's no easy way to overthrow this kind of government. Sending in a few special forces will not do it. There is no magic trick. If we are going to try in the short run to change the government, we would have to be willing to commit to sending in very large numbers of ground forces. The Bush administration made the decision at the end of the Persian Gulf War that it was not prepared to pursue that objective at a time when the forces were in place and could have done so. And so we need to be realistic about what can be done in the short run to try to change that government.
Bloomington, Indiana on the moderate line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to address the Jerusalem issue. It seems to me that President Clinton may have made a strategic mistake in sending a signal, a very strong signal, that he supported an independent Palestinian state, which seems now to have led to the demise of Netanyahu's government. From my view, it seems to me that the central issue is Jerusalem. Netanyahu's problems today seems to be Arafat's determination to publicly state that there's going to be a Palestinian state, and Netanyahu has asked him to withdraw that comment. Isn't it about time that the United States make a more formal, and when I say make a more formal, I know that the U.S. Senate has voted to, in the past, to have the embassy in Jerusalem, but shouldn't the official position of the United States, shouldn't we publicly come out and say that we're going to support Netanyahu with an undivided Jerusalem?
Mr. Wolfowitz, why don't you take that first?
Well, I think Netanyahu's objection has been to the idea that Arafat would unilaterally declare a Palestinian state. I think the whole idea, and I think it's the right idea in these negotiations, is that certain fundamental issues like statehood and the status of Jerusalem should be settled together on a negotiated basis, not on a unilateral basis. And I think in a way the same thing applies to moving the embassy. I don't think one should unilaterally stake out positions on these issues. They need to be negotiated, and relatively soon, I believe.
Mr. Halperin?
Well, I think our hope is that the Y agreement will be implemented. That will now presumably have to occur after the elections, and then we will move on to the critical phase, which is the so-called final settlement negotiations, in which these issues need to be negotiated and settled between the parties. This is not something that we can impose on them.
Timing for the election? Do we know?
I think
I thought I saw someplace before May or something like that.
Maybe as late as June, I think.
Really?
But I think they're now saying the first half of the year.
Sugarloaf, California. You're next. Good morning.
Yes. Yes, say some miracle we do knock out Hassan. What is our guarantee that we're not going to have someone just as bad as him in there?
Mr. Halperin.
Well, I think that's part of the dilemma. I mean, we would like to see a democratic Iraq, but as Mr. Wolfowitz started with, there is not a lot of democracy in those countries, and we certainly cannot assure that the successor would be more favorable. I think our hope is that a successor government would understand that the only way Iraq is going to get back into the international community is to get rid of its weapons of mass destruction and to try to move forward from there.
But we would have a better chance of having a decent Iraqi government if we took a more active policy. That's my view. The way we're sitting back and waiting, we're essentially waiting for another awful general to stage a coup, and I believe what we should be doing, it's not invading Iraq, it's not sending massive troops to Baghdad. I think the Bush administration was right when they didn't do that. I think it's a false alternative. I think the mistake that President Bush made and this administration has now been making for 6 years is failing to support the Iraqi people when they rose up in rebellion against Saddam Hussein in 1991 and again in 1996, and I think they would be ready to do it any time they thought there was serious American support.
Mr. Halperin, let me ask you about Barbara Crossett's piece in this morning's New York Times. She says that the Clinton administration, under pressure to make some concessions to other Security Council members after the Iraq bombing, may be willing to consider closing the file on nuclear inspections, diplomats and independent arms control experts said today. Are you willing to close the file, meaning to relax the check?
I don't want to get into what our position may be. As I've said, our view is that this needs to be discussed among the members of the Security Council and move forward from there. Our view remains that the inspectors must go back and that we must be assured in each of the areas, nuclear, chemical, and biological, that in fact the capacity to make those weapons and any existing materials have been destroyed. And it may be possible to reach closure in one area before another, but we would not accept anything short of assurances from the inspectors that the goal had been accomplished.
You can't ever reach closure with Saddam Hussein. Whatever you negotiate one month, he's going to change the rules the next month. And I think what that story illustrates is the pressure on the United States, particularly now after this bombing, to keep eroding away at the controls over Saddam Hussein is going to be enormous. And that's why I believe we need to get much more serious about the fact that he's the problem, and we need to take active steps to get rid of him.
I think the bombing has strengthened our position. It's not weakened it, because it's made it clear to our allies and to Saddam Hussein that we are prepared to use military force. They're prepared to do it with whatever allies are willing to join us in that effort, and that we are not going to walk away from the situation.
Austin, Texas, on the Liberal line. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I was curious. I had a question for the panel. I was wondering, number one, what do they think the odds are of, given the economic crisis in Asia, what do you think the odds are of Japan attempting to rearm themselves in an effort to boost their economy? And number two, what do they think the future with relations between China and Taiwan are going to be given economic hardships?
Mr. Halperin.
Well, I don't think there is any danger at the moment that Japan will seek to rearm to move their way out of it. If they're willing to increase spending, which we think they should do, and we've been urging them to do for some time, there are many things they can spend money on other than on armament. They need a consensus within Japan on the spending, and there would not be a consensus now on a substantial rearmament program, nor do we think that's a sensible way for them to spend their money.
And China, Taiwan?
Well, that remains a difficult problem, and one that we continue to hope will be resolved peacefully and in the context of our position recognizing one China.
Can that be done?
I think that if we keep stressing, and I think we need to stress the need for any resolution to this issue to be peaceful and not imposed unilaterally from either side, I think, but it's going to take a very long time. It's going to take, I think, real political change in China before we get to that point.
The Washington Post chose as its middle story today, front page attention, the activists in China getting some what they call stiff sentences. I won't try to pronounce the names of the people, but these are people who have been around a long time. What's the reaction of the administration to this?
The administration is very disturbed, and we issued a strong statement expressing our regret not only that these people were arrested, but that the trials were conducted in a way that's inconsistent with the due process rights which are required by the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the Chinese have indicated they're prepared to put into effect, and that the sentences were very long, again, inconsistent with the commitments that the Chinese made. The fundamental problem is that the Chinese are not prepared to accept peaceful political dissent, despite the fact that both the Universal Declaration and the Covenant, to which they've now claimed to accept, require them to do so.
Do we have any political leverage?
Well, I think this is a real step backwards from where China was when President Clinton visited. In fact, these are not dissidents. These are really rather mainstream people who were encouraged to believe back at the time of the president's visit that they could create a new party in China. And I don't think we understand exactly why the Chinese reversed their own decision, because I think it must be a sign of some real argument in China about this direction. But I believe we have influence, and while I applaud the fact that we made a strong statement yesterday, the fact is this has been going on for 3 weeks, and the strong statement didn't come from the President or from the Secretary of State. It came from the State Department. I think, particularly given the lengths to which this administration's gone in the last year to improve relations with China, I think it's time for the President himself to speak out. This may be the most important story of the year in its long-term effects.
Let me ask you a question within your answer. You said that the State Department spokesman said it, not the Secretary of State.
Correct.
What does that mean? How do people interpret that?
As lower level. There's no question when it is said personally by a cabinet officer, and even more when it's said personally by the President or Vice President, it is really taken as a statement of fundamental American policy. The State Department spokesman briefs the press every day. Some of the things that they say are considered very routine. I don't mean to minimize it. It is a statement of the U.S. position, but it's much stronger when it begins to be associated with a prominent figure.
So when you are trying to make a decision as to how strong a statement is to be made to a country, is who's going to make the discussion
That is
part
certainly
of it?
part of it. I suspect we spend a lot more time deciding on these nuances than anybody else notices. The Secretary of State is, in fact, on vacation. I suspect if she had not been on vacation, it might well have been issued in her name. It was a little up from answering a question. That is, we actually issued a formal statement and then answered questions about it, rather than the spokesman just responding to questions about the subject. But I think there is no question that we are deeply disturbed about this. I agree. I think this is a very important story because, in my view, what it reflects is the weakness in China. The weakness of the government in the face of a very strong desire in that society for democracy. And I think what the Chinese leadership is debating, and it really goes back to Tiananmen Square, and the still continuing debate in the leadership about whether that was the right decision and whether the people who demonstrated were true patriots or not, that the Chinese leadership is very fearful, and I think properly so, of the strong desire for democracy in China. We have made it clear that in the long run, and even in the short run, we would like to see a democratic regime there, as we'd like to see in every country, and that we will continue to try to find ways to give support to the people struggling for democracy while dealing with the Chinese government, as we have to, on security matters which directly affect the security of the United States.
Morton Halperin and Paul Wolfowitz at the table this morning. Foreign Affairs is our issue. Rochester, New York is next on the Moderate Line. Good morning.
Good morning. I would like to comment on something that Mr. Halperin said earlier regarding the fact that there was no connection between the bombing of Iraq and Mr. Clinton's political problems, because I am very concerned about this, because as I see it, I believe that the bombing benefited Mr. Clinton in 3 different ways. I think that, first of all, it did delay the hearing, and it only delayed it 1 day as it turned out, but potentially it could have delayed it for much longer. Also, I think that it stopped the momentum of the polls that were showing that if he was impeached, that people were calling for a resignation. And I think that, I haven't heard anyone say this, but I think it's so clear to me. People are saying, why is his approval rating so high now at 72%? I think it has 2%. I think it has everything to do with the bombing of Iraq. I think Republicans and Democrats alike supported this. It should have part of his calculated risk in doing it at a time when he was being impeached.
Rochester, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Halperin.
I think that's simply wrong. There is no evidence that timing was in any way related to this. It put the debate off for one day. The vote was the same in any case. But if you look at the evidence, the report came in from the UN inspector, Mr. Butler, and that's what we responded to. Secretary Cohn, who is a lifelong Republican, for many years a United States Senator from Maine, said absolutely unequivocally that he would put his own reputation on the line to say that there was no domestic political motivation for this, that this was a recommendation that he made, that the Joint Chiefs made, that had the support of the national security community. The decision was on timing, was made purely on the basis of the foreign factors and not at all on our domestic politics.
But I assume, in fact, that the decision on this kind of thing wouldn't be made on domestic political calculations. Not. But the timing, in a sense, was forced on the administration by months and months of putting off this issue, of trying to avoid the issue. And the timing was spectacularly bad because, number one, everyone in the Middle East believes that it was done for domestic political reasons, and that's harmful. And number two, it was started, as they said, they had to get it in before Ramadan. Well, that meant from the day they began that everyone knew it would last 3 or 4 days. This is really just a slightly larger pinprick, and that is going to hurt American credibility in Iraq and in the region.
In the future?
In the immediate present, actually.
Let's take a call from Watertown, Tennessee, in conservative line. Good morning.
Good morning. Let me ask you something. Isn't the real reason that we're anti-Iraq or in the rest of the Middle East and pro-Israel because our CIA, our State Department, and really the rest of our government is being run by Jews, and that is the reason why we bombed Iraq?
Mr. Wolfowitz.
I don't think that question's worthy of an answer. I'm sorry.
Mr. Halperin.
I agree.
Let me ask you about what you were reading this morning, because I know you both took a look at the newspapers this morning. What's the first story in terms of the foreign affairs that we haven't talked about that you brought with you this morning?
China on top. Let me just say, I do think the Bob Livingston resignation is a foreign affairs story, because he was one of the most thoughtful Republicans, in fact, one of the most thoughtful members of either party in the Congress on foreign affairs. I had the privilege of first meeting him 12 years ago when we were trying to put together a delegation to observe the Philippine elections that ultimately got rid of President Marcos. And it was very hard to get any U.S. politician to travel 12,000 miles to Manila to be associated with what they thought was going to be a political failure. And he went in that group, and he's been a leader on Asian issues and on many other issues, and he's really going to be missed.
Do you know anything about Mr. Hastert and what he brings?
I know nothing. I hope he'll be a good speaker, but I think, in fact, his experience and knowledge of foreign affairs is minuscule compared to Congressman Livingston.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, one of the specific issues that administration was looking forward to working with him on, the Secretary of State had talked to him about, is the issue of our UN arrears. We owe a great deal of money to the UN. There is now a consensus in the Congress that we should pay the money. It's been held up by it being attached to an unrelated issue relating to support for family planning. Mr. Livingston was committed to getting the money paid, and our hope is that the new speaker will carry that on, but he does not bring to it the same long-time commitment to this issue.
What about you and the stories that you've found
Well,
this
I
morning?
had picked out a story on Libya. As you know, we have been trying to persuade the Libyan government to release the 2 people who have been indicted for blowing up the airplane at Lockerbie now 10 years ago. And we've been able to get Security Council sanctions that have put pressure on Libya to release them. And I think it's an example of what I consider to be a very important trend in the world, that is the ability of the world community to come together through the Security Council to deal with problems like terrorism that have to be dealt with on a worldwide basis. The hope is that we are very close, finally, to getting these 2 people yielded up for a trial, which we've now agreed will be in the Netherlands.
I'm puzzled, though. I mean, these people worked for Libyan intelligence. They didn't go to the bathroom without Gaddafi's permission. I don't understand why we think trying them and putting them in jail is going to deal with the real culprit, who is the president of Libya.
Well, I think that one of the reasons you have a trial is to learn more about what happened and see whether other people should be indicted as well. And
so your hope is that at a trial more information would come out?
Well, there's no commitment to to not move beyond them to others if we learn about them at the trial. And that may be obviously one of the reasons why the Libyan government has been unwilling to yield them up. But I think one of the important aspects of the story is that we've been able to get the world community to bring this pressure. If the sanctions were not in place, the Libyans would not even be talking to us about it.
Norfolk, Virginia, on the Liberal line. Good morning.
Good morning. My question was for the gentleman with the State Department, just regarding if he knows the administration's long-term mission or policy regarding military presence in the region.
Which region?
In the Middle East. I mean, we've had military there now for over 7 years, and I think it is affecting military readiness, recruiting, and so much more.
Now you're calling from Norfolk. Do you live there as in relation to the military?
No, I don't. I'm just a citizen, but have many neighbors and coworkers who are military related, and it is definitely our presence, prolonged presence there, is affecting all aspects of military readiness, they've been telling me.
Mr. Halperin.
Well, I think there's a human dimension to this that we're all aware of and concerned about. When you have troops stationed abroad for so long, it has an impact on their families and on their family lives. As far as readiness is concerned, the President is determined to maintain the readiness of the forces and to spend the money that's necessary to do that. But we need to be in a position also to use military force when it's required to do so, so that readiness is for a purpose, and the purpose is to have the forces available when the President determines that they need to be used.
But her question was the long-term policy.
Well, the long-term policy is to keep forces there at levels and for a length of time that's necessary to bring about an acceptable solution to this problem, and that means getting rid of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
But the level of force deployment and the expenditure of cruise missiles and other ordnance is much, much higher as long as Saddam Hussein is in power. And we hear it said, well, it would be very costly and difficult to support an effort to remove him. The Congress a few months ago voted $100 million of military support for the Iraqi opposition, and I've heard people, including administration people, say, oh, well, it would take a lot more than that. Well, we spent a lot more than that in just 4 days of bombing. We probably spent over $500 million just on bombs and cruise missiles alone. I think we are seriously underestimating the cost to the United States of continuing to tolerate Saddam Hussein in power, and I think we're overestimating the difficulty of doing something about it.
So what is what is the alternative for you then?
The alternative would be to provide serious support, and that includes weapons, but it also includes American air support and maybe some use of American ground troops to allow the Iraqi people, who almost to a person hate Saddam Hussein, to overthrow him. We had an opportunity, a magnificent opportunity in 1991, and I'm afraid we lost that one. At the end of the Gulf War, we were too focused on simply getting him out of Kuwait. But we've had 7 years now to learn that as long as he's around, there's going to be trouble, and very big trouble. And his people have known for a very long time that as long as he's around, all of them are in danger.
Would there be any circumstances that would cause ground troops to be going in to that area?
Well, I think our policy is to seek his removal. Now, I think nobody disagrees that we're not going to get an adequate solution there until he is removed from power, but to move in a way that's consistent with our overall interests on the need to maintain support from other countries and to maintain the Security Council sanctions.
Let's go to Prattville, Alabama next on the moderate line. Good morning.
Good morning. I don't have a question as much as I did a comment.
Go ahead.
I spent 30 years in the military, and I spent a lot of time working in the State Department when Ambassador Schultz created a terrorism ambassadorship. I believe that was Paul Bremer, the Deputy Secretary. It doesn't make any difference.
That's right.
But I just have a comment, and maybe these folks want to comment back. Dealing with the Middle East, in my opinion, I guess you could call it professional opinion, is that we get too much hope that there's going to be some solution to problems in the Middle East, and I think that's wrong.
We get too much hope.
Well, let me finish. I don't think there's a solution to the Middle East problems in the near term. I learned a great deal from Secretary Schultz, and his approach to this was that dealing with the Middle East is something like keeping about 4 balls in the air at one time. You have to do that constantly. And when you let one of those balls hit the ground, you have trouble in the Middle East. And I believe you can see that if you see what's happened over there. It's been a problem with Libya. It's been a problem with the Israelis sometimes. It's been a problem with the Iraqis. And my opinion about this last raid is that we just gave the Iranians a leg up for the next war with the Iraqis, because I believe that'll happen. They fight about every 20 years. They fight down to a level where they kill all their men and their older boys, young men. They kill down to the level of about 16 years old, and they wait till they grow some more, and they fight again. And I suspect there'll be another war over there soon.
Mr. Wolfowitz, thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, I agree with the caller. No one should expect any permanent peace in the Middle East, but I think there really has been, in the case of the Arab-Israeli relations, enormous progress, particularly between Israel and Egypt, between Israel and Jordan, but also even between Israel and the Palestinians. As bad as the situation is, it's much better than what it was 10 years ago. The other thing is, this may sound far too hopeful, I'm sure it does to the caller, but we have yet to see a real democracy emerge in the Arab world, and yet 10 years ago people would have said there's no hope for democracy in countries like Romania that have been totally corrupted by communist dictatorship. I think Iraq may be a country that's ready for a different kind of government, and I do think if we once get even a single Arab country that moves toward democracy, it's going to change the face of the Middle East.
Mr. Halperin, the caller's analogy of the 4 balls in the air.
I think it's more like 7. I mean, I think certainly it is hard to be optimistic about the Middle East. The problems there are very difficult. But I also agree with Paul that the merely hopeful sign is the possibility of peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And that would create a fundamental transformation of the situation. And I think, therefore, one of our priorities has to be to keep moving that peace process forward.
Mr. Halperin, this fax in from West Orange, New Jersey. With the new unified Europe, what is the need for American involvement in NATO?
Well, unfortunately, the Europeans, while they continue to move towards unification, have not yet shown the political will to deal with the problems of Europe without our support. You go back to the Bush administration, its initial approach to Bosnia was that that's a European problem, and we saw the results of that in genocide, in terrible violations of human rights, and ultimately the United States had to come in and take the lead in bringing about a solution using the NATO alliance. We see the same thing now in Kosovo. So I think that obviously we would hope that the Europeans would take on a greater share of the responsibility and the burden for dealing with European problems, but I think the need for continued American presence and American leadership is very clear.
Do you ever foresee a day when we won't be in NATO? Or NATO won't exist?
I don't try to predict that far in the future. I think for a very long time to come, Europe needs the United States and the United States needs Europe.
Ogden, Utah, on the conservative line. Good morning.
Good morning. I had 3 points. I wonder if you could jot down notes in case I can cover them.
Promise you. We'll make sure we get them all.
Okay. First one is the gentleman who wrote Year of the Rat were a guest on your show, and they indicated that the general who commanded the troops in Tiananmen Square had been received at the Pentagon with some kind of ceremony. But the pictures did not end up in America. But they were available in China.
And where did you hear this?
On the Washington Journal.
And who said it?
The gentleman who wrote Year of the Rat.
Okay. I know which book you're talking about. Go ahead. Your second question?
Yeah, well, the dissidents were arrested. I wonder if they were undermined by seeing that picture in China, which kind of sends a clear message the U.S. supports the current situation. The second one is, what is the impact of the technology transfers that we've given to the Chinese on our national security?
And third?
The third point is, just as an untrained observer, when President Clinton went to China, the main message I got out of it was to the Taiwanese, which is basically, you're swinging in the breeze.
Thanks. Third part of that, when President Clinton went to China.
I think the president made a terrible mistake when he went to China and issued the so-called 3 no's. It's the Chinese version of long-term China-Taiwan policy. I don't think the United States should have embraced it. It certainly shouldn't have embraced it when he was in China. And I think it's had a bad effect in Taiwan. Ultimately, it doesn't change the basic fact, I think, that I hope the Chinese understand the United States is committed to a peaceful resolution of that issue and a non-use of force, but I think that was a big mistake, and it demoralized the people in Taiwan who had been assured that we wouldn't make that kind of statement while the president was there.
Impact of the technology transfer?
Well, let me say a word on this, because one needs to remember that when there was a Chinese attempt to rattle their sword vis-a-vis Taiwan and fire missiles, the United States president moved military force quickly into the region and made it clear that we would not accept a military solution to the problem. So that you can argue about the impact of one statement or another, I think the reality of the presence of American military forces and the willing to augment it sent a very clear message to the Chinese leadership that we expect and want a peaceful settlement to that situation. I don't know enough about the details of the technological transfer, which occurred through some contractors, to comment on that.
Do you, sir?
Well, I think we need to be much more careful than we've been, because sometimes I think we make a mistake of thinking that satellites are peaceful and they'd have nothing to do with missiles, but the fact is the same technology that allows a missile to release 4 or 10 different communication satellites can allow a similar missile to release 4 or 10 different ballistic missile warheads. And I think the real strategic problem with China is not next year or the year after, it's longer term. But I think longer term we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently or stupidly give away a very, very important technological leads for the United States.
Yeah. Can I? Sure. I mean, I agree with that, but I think we also have to recognize, as we try to balance these long-term concerns and our concern about human rights with the current realities of our national security. I mean, take the most dramatic example: the United States continues to have large military forces in South Korea. They confront a North Korean military, which, while in the end would be defeated in a war, can inflict enormous casualties in the short run on American forces, on Korean society. And we do a variety of things to try to deter that, but one of the things is to seek and get the cooperation of the Chinese government in trying to deal with that problem in a peaceful way. That's enormously important to American security, and we need to deal with it in a way that takes account of the longer run problems and takes account of the human rights. But we can't walk away from those concerns and just say we're unhappy with their arrest of dissidents, so we're not going to deal with them.
Are either of you familiar with the first point he made about the ceremony at the Pentagon?
Well, it was the general. I think he was the chief of staff. He happened to have been the commander of Tiananmen, and I think it was awkward. And I think I don't. There are mixed signals here. Some of them have been good. Some of them have been negative. I wish in the last few weeks, and not just the last few days, when the arrests of these democratic activists in China had started, that we had spoken up more quickly. On the last point, no one is saying disengage with China, have nothing to do with China. As a matter of fact, the Chinese haven't been terribly helpful on Korea, but they could be very important. But none of what we're getting from China is a justification for releasing advanced missile technology to China. What we haven't been, I believe, is sufficiently discriminating in our relationship. We shouldn't veer in the direction of confrontation, but we also shouldn't veer, as I think the president really did in his trip last summer, toward opening the doors to everything, treating China as, I think the word was, a strategic partner. China's a long way from being a strategic partner of the United States.
We're going to take 2 calls in a row, so keep those pins out. We'll take both of them, and then we'll get you to respond to both of them. Tampa, Florida, on the Liberal line is next. Good morning.
Hello. I was wondering, there's a lot of religious people that believe that the Middle East problems can even be dated back to Isaac and Ishmael. I was wondering, when you go through your policy on how to deal with these problems in the Middle East, if you ever, if theological experts or prophetic experts are ever brought into the equation, and if you ever listen to them seriously.
Okay, thanks, Florida. We'll take another question, and we'll get back to both of them. The next one is from Kailua, Hawaii. Good morning, on the Moderate line.
Yes, we're out here in Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And
welcome.
We're wondering, given the importance of naval power, particularly to the defense of our interests in the Western Pacific and in the Persian Gulf, why is it that the State Department and the Republicans in Congress seem to have been so ineffective in getting a reasonable hearing for the Law of the Sea Treaty, and getting the United States aboard on that. It seems to me that our being a non-party to the 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea has really hurt our national power and our sea power in particular.
What is the Law of the Sea?
The Law of the Sea Treaty is a convention that was negotiated over a period of about 10 years, 1973 to 1982, and was concluded in 1982. And we have been completely unable to get a hearing in Congress to work towards ratification of that treaty.
Mr. Halperin.
Then they renegotiated it.
Well, I think that the Reagan administration had some objections to the treaty at the time, which Paul may know about, which since have been rectified, and we now hope that the Senate will ratify the treaty.
The treaty really has two parts. It had important provisions on navigation, which we agreed with, which have in effect been implemented. In fact, I was ambassador to Indonesia. We negotiated a tax treaty with Indonesia. As part of the addendum to that tax treaty, of all places, the Indonesian has had us commit to the navigation provisions of the Law of the Sea Treaty. But the other part of that treaty was to create a big international bureaucracy that would have controlled deep sea mining, and not only the Reagan administration, but overwhelming majorities in both houses of the Congress were opposed to this idea of another large bureaucracy controlling what could ultimately in the long run be an important commercial industry.
The first question, do theological issues ever come up in the discussion when you're trying to decide what your policy will be for a country like Israel?
Well, they certainly come up in the sense that we recognize that religious beliefs influence people's behavior, and that therefore we try to understand those beliefs as we try to understand what's happening and predict how different policies might be implemented.
Is that difficult sometimes?
It is. I think it was Yogi Berra who said that predictions are difficult, especially about the future.
I actually think that was Casey Stengel.
Casey Stengel.
Get your baseball history right. El Paso, Texas, on the conservative line. Good morning. El Paso, you there? Good morning.
From El Paso.
You're on the air, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I'd like to say shalom and happy Hanukkah. And I was very distraught about that comment from a caller a few whiles back. But what I'd like to ask about is this, the desert fox thing. Was that just a sting? I understand that Ramadan is very important and it's going to have an impact, but where are we going to go from there?
Mr. Halperin.
Well, I think we've made it clear that if the circumstances arrive where additional use of military force will be required, that's something the President will consider and take whatever action is appropriate. I think we sent a clear message that we're prepared to use military force, and that the time now is to go back to negotiations at the Security Council to lead to the return of the UMSCOM inspectors and moving forward on the plan that the Security Council has enforced.
Desert Fox is a strange name. I don't know if it's meant to imply we're being clever, because I don't think we were very clever. Maybe it's meant to imply deception, in which case I think we were deceiving ourselves. We have no idea where his weapons of mass destruction are. That's the whole problem with having allowed the inspectors to be kicked out for months. And we probably were blowing up a lot of empty buildings. So I don't think blowing up the empty buildings for 10 more days would have done more good. But if we were actually targeting something of military value, and I think what would have been a military value would be in the context of an entirely different policy where there was an active armed opposition to Saddam Hussein, then there's no way you could do much in 4 days. I think this was just a large pinprick.
Why don't we know where the arms are?
Well, it's very hard, particularly with biological weapons that can be made in very small places, to know where they're being made or to know where some may be stored. So this is not an easy problem.
When you get up in the morning, obviously you have to do a lot of reading in foreign affairs issues. What newspaper do you grab first, and what to get the best foreign affairs reporting?
Well, I don't know that there's a connection between those two things. As a native New Yorker, I grabbed the New York Times first, and that's a lifelong
So you
habit.
go to your heart first instead of your head.
And then to the Post, and then I come into my office where the Washington Times is waiting for me, and which I think is an important part of the picture, not only because it sometimes covers stories that others don't, but because it also covers the Washington debates on these issues in a different way.
Who are some of the best reporters on foreign affairs issues?
Oh, that's a question I think I won't touch.
Oh, I'm going to get you in trouble if you say, Mr. Wolfowitz, you're not in government
one of the
anymore.
things that's really unfortunate is, I mean, two of the best columnists in foreign affairs are Tom Friedman and Jim Hoagland. I can say that, I think, without fear of offending too many others, because unfortunately we're down to where there are very few foreign affairs columnists. I think even the major papers, and I read all the ones that Mort mentions, their coverage of international affairs is declining. I think there's a circular problem here that people say the public isn't interested, and so then the politicians don't talk about it. The president spent his first 2 years saying it was the economy stupid. The world in certain ways is much safer for the United States than it's been any time in this century, but if we continue down this road of thinking we can ignore it, I think we'll end up with what could be a very dangerous situation for our children 20 years from now.
Tom Friedman of the New York Times, Jim Hoagland of the Washington Post. What makes those two?
They've been serious students of foreign affairs for a long time.
Length of time is important.
Well, and their contacts, they work hard at these are people who you might think would sit back and just pontificate, but no, they're out there digging out facts on every news story.
Providence, Rhode Island on the Liberal line. You're next. Good morning.
Good morning. Before I go on to ask my question, I would like to say I strongly disagree with Mr. Wolfowitz. Basically, as during both the Reagan and the Bush administration, I know I and many of my friends really felt that our government was out of touch with the average American's concerns about the massive loss of jobs and the decrease in wages. And I would like Mr. Halperin and Mr. Wolfowitz to please answer this question. It's regarding human rights. How seriously committed does the United States look to their concerns of human rights when so many American corporations are going overseas, closing down plants here and opening them up in third world countries where workers are exploited and mistreated?
Is that happening to you in Rhode Island?
I know Hasbro has been closing plants down regularly, but it's happening all over the country. I'm very aware that I communicate with people on the internet, and I read articles in magazines and newspapers about that, where a plant is closing down in Rhode Island right now, and they're talking about reopening overseas. So,
Mr. Halperin, how do you deal with that in your job?
Well, there's no easy solution to it. I mean, I think American business and other business needs to be able to invest where they think it's appropriate to do so. At the same time, the administration has been working with business to develop what are called codes of conduct for how they should operate abroad, and urge them to take account of labor rights, workers' rights, as well as human rights within the country in which they're operating, so that the American presence can be part of the effort to improve human rights in these situations.
Mr. Wolfowitz, as somebody who used to be in an administration and worked with that, is it difficult sometimes in looking at a foreign policy issue when you know you need to go this way, but you realize that it can cause domestic problems this way? Do you keep your eye on the foreign policy?
Well, we're taking as far as the question goes, I think the basic point is that the United States is better off in all respects, including American workers and American jobs, because we have worked very hard to open up markets abroad. The caller complains that we're sending jobs abroad. The fact is we are creating spectacular numbers of new jobs in the United States, and they tend to be better quality, higher paid, more valuable jobs. When you do that, of course, the less skilled jobs have to go somewhere, and they go overseas, and it's a net gain for us and for poor people in the world who lacked jobs before. I think, on balance, the policies now of Reagan and Bush and Clinton in this respect have been continuous, and if the callers seem to object to my notion that we should pay attention to foreign affairs as though that's somehow at the expense of worrying about the economy, I don't believe that's the case. I think, in fact, if we don't pay attention, for example, to the state of the sorry state of the economies in Asia today, we may pay for it a year or two from now in a loss of American jobs. I think that, on the whole, our involvement abroad, our promotion of American interests abroad, advances our economy at home.
Daytona Beach, hello.
Good morning.
Morning.
I was just curious to ask Mr. Wolfowitz, is it?
Correct.
Yeah. If he was studying the foreign policies, say, 30, 35 years ago when John F. Kennedy was shot.
Well, I was actually a student at the time. Yes, I was.
Well, because my big question is, my father was in the military, and we were over in Europe at that time. I believe we were in France when Kennedy was shot. And I noticed, even as a child, a distinct change in the European outlook of Americans being on their soil. You know, and I'm thinking my dad was TDY over in the region that's having so many problems now, the Middle East. And I was just curious, like, whenever something happens to in our country, how much effect does that have, like, on foreign soil? It's how they look at us. Because I remember growing up and seeing on the walls written back in the 60s, Yankee go home. And this was like almost immediately after Kennedy was shot. And I was thinking, you know, this big, I wondered what happened in history recently that started the decline in our popularity in the Middle East. I know it's been going over and over and over in the past 30 years. It's been sharply declining. But, I mean, back then, was there a correlation between his being shot and also the decline in our power in that region?
I don't think there's that association, and I think sometimes what people think is a decline is a change from a year ago to this year, but if you look at it over a longer period of time, it goes up and down. It seems to go up every time they need us, and it goes down when they don't need us anymore. So, for example, there was a huge increase in American popularity in the Middle East back in 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, excuse me. And after we kicked the Iraqis out of Kuwait, then a lot of people went back to their old habits of finding it convenient to criticize the United States. I'm afraid it goes with responsibilities that we have, and responsibilities that we have because if we don't get certain jobs done, no one will do them, and we do them for our own interests as well as other people's interests, but they're free to sit on the sidelines and be Monday morning quarterbacks.
Umatilla, Florida, on the conservative line. Good morning. Go ahead, Florida. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. I was wondering.
Yeah, well, I need to punch the button, and I didn't, so my fault. Go ahead.
All right. I've got a two-part question. One is on Europe. I'm formerly with SATMO in Somalia and spent a lot of time in Europe and Asia. And I did my 20 years. I remember Mr. Wolfowitz and a lot of his policies back then. I didn't fully understand them, but I've got a better grasp nowadays, and I'm able to sit back. Anyway, Europe and the NATO and the UN, they all seem to consider us as not putting in our fair share. And why is it Europe has more people, more money as a total under the free democracies, and they don't elect to fund their military in order to continue police actions over there, which we are doing, and then we have to pay the budget of the UN for our portion, the 25%. And there's no offset for all of our actions, and Europe continues to point fingers at us. You know, I know Germans and French, and I've dealt with everyone over there, especially the British. And the other point is Israel. I've worked with Israelis, and I think that is our one ace in the hole as far as the whole Middle East. We've got to support them completely, but if you take a look at the Palestinian issue, Yasser Arafat only said that he renounced tourists, and I remember back in the 60s or the 70s that he called a military action bombing a school with a bunch of Israeli kids in there, and I can't forget that. And I think he's changed.
What did you say you were part of, SATMO?
Yes, ma'am.
What's that?
That was a military augmentation of training foreign soldiers.
And where did you do that?
I was in Somalia under Ambassador Oakley.
Thank you very much. Mr. Halperin?
Well, as far as Europe and its fair share is concerned, it's a complicated question. The Europeans actually now spend almost as much collectively on defense as we do. The problem is that a lot of the money is wasted because they have all these separate militaries and they're spending it on the headquarters and so on. There has recently been an initiative by the British government to try to create a more effective means by which the Europeans could take collective military action. And we have indicated that as long as that's in the context of NATO and is supportive of the NATO alliance, that we think it's a useful step forward. As far as the UN is concerned, we have an obligation to pay our dues. I think we ought to pay our dues. We're also talking about changing the percentages so that we have less of a percentage, but we have outstanding obligations and we ought to pay them.
This fact says, regarding the back dues, earlier this year, Clinton vetoed a bill that would have paid at least part of what we are supposed to owe to the UN. I hope that what we are spending on Desert Fox is credited to the USA as payment in kind.
Well, the problem, first of all, the President vetoed the bill because it included an extraneous provision relating to limits on our ability to support family planning and limits on the activities of American organizations. As far as credit for the dues, I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding. Many countries take military action pursuant to Security Council resolutions. The British and French did for a long time in Bosnia. Nobody's reimbursed for those. Reimbursement occurs only if you're operating under a UN commander. UN Security Council endorsement of our military action, while we don't believe is required, is certainly very helpful. And if we took the position that we then expect to be reimbursed by the UN, it would be much harder for us to get that Security Council endorsement that is helpful to us in pursuing our own objectives.
But the caller is right. We spend an enormous amount on humanitarian operations, some of them UN, some of them sort of UN affiliated, which cost us a lot of money and which don't give us any credit toward our UN dues. I agree we should pay our UN dues, but I think those dues should take much more account than they do of what we expend. And the caller is responsible, along with 20 or 30,000 other Americans, and I commend them all for saving what may have been 200,000 people from starving to death in Somalia. That was a wonderful thing to do, but I don't see why that shouldn't in some way turn up in credit when we're doing UN accounts.
Portland, Oregon, you're next on the Liberal Line. Good morning.
Good morning. The Bush administration helped support Saddam Hussein in his war against Iran, and so we helped put him in where he is today. And the reason Iran is because we helped put the Shah in power, and we seem like the United States has created a lot of the problems that we're having to deal with now.
Mr. Wolfowitz.
Well, I don't think the United States has to take responsibility for everything that was done wrong in Iran or for the Iran-Iraq war. By the way, the Iran-Iraq war was over by the time President Bush became president. It is true, during the Reagan administration, the United States and most of our allies in the Middle East were supporting Iraq not because they liked Saddam Hussein, but because of the incredibly horrible consequences that would have taken place if Iran had won that war. It was a matter, and I'm not happy about it, of choosing between the lesser of two evils. One of the quite valuable things that came out of the American victory in 1991 in the Gulf War is that we don't have to balance Iran off against Iraq or Iraq against Iran. We now have enough American strength in the region to be able to provide for the security of that region ourselves. It gives us more responsibility, but it also gives us much more control over the course of events.
Paul Wolfowitz has been dean at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced Studies since 1992. Mort Halperin has been the director of policy planning staff at the State Department since December 8th. Thank you both for joining us this morning. We're going to take a couple more calls. Here we go next to Ellenton, Florida on the moderate line. Good morning.
Good morning. Isn't this I have a question to ask about this. I'm a little bit nervous about it. And isn't it true that Saddam Hussein's actual defiance against the United States at this particular time, especially after trying to get rid of these dangerous weapons from Iraq's arsenal and stopping him from doing this in the future, isn't it true that actually we have been giving aid and comfort to the enemy because of the congressional actions during this period of time?
Which period of time?
Of the last week's attack on Iraq's arsenal.
And how were we giving aid and comfort?
By the Congress defying the president and actually defiling him during this period of time.
Mr. Halperin?
That I was in the military back in the 50s, and I worked for the federal and for the U.S. military for 17 years. And I still think that this is giving aid and comfort to the enemy.
Thanks. Mr. Halperin.
Well, I think we have to be prepared to have public debate in the United States even when we're engaged in military action. But I think, as I said, it was unfortunate that in the opening day of the military action, there were doubts raised about the motive of the president and the reason why that was carried out. I think that is unfortunate, but I think there was quickly a rallying around the troops. But at the same time, I believe that it continues to be legitimate for people to express their dissent about the policy.
Caller, if you saw some grinning around the table as you said, we were not grinning at your question. We were grinning at the fact that both of our guests here have corrected what I just said. Mr. Wolfowitz has been dean at the Johns Hopkins University of Advanced Studies since 1994, not 1992. And Mr. Halperin has been director of the policy planning staff at the State Department since December 7th, not December 8th. So correction well noted. Thank you, gentlemen. Let's go next to Alexandria, Virginia. Good morning, Alexandria.
Yes, good morning.
You're on the air, ma'am. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. First of all, I want to go back to when Clinton attacked Afghanistan and Sudan. We know very well what happened in the Sudan. We spent $70 million, and of course the Afghanistan headquarters are tense, so they just moved away. And then I think that the United States played right in Saddam's hands this time. He didn't want to let the inspectors come in, and he kept harassing them and harassing them. Now we've bombed them, so he's got a good excuse not to let anybody in. And I do think we should get rid of Clinton, not because of Monica, because I think his foreign policy is a disaster. And I'd like to know if it's true that in Haiti now, the country's run by drug dealers. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's just take that last part since we've talked really basically through the first part. Our policy with Haiti now, and she asked the question, is Haiti run by...
policy in Haiti?
And she said, and is Haiti run by drug dealers, if I understood it correctly.
Unfortunately, what happens in many countries where there is a growth of democracy and greater freedom is that you encounter various kinds of organized crime. We've seen that in Russia, and I think you've seen that in Haiti and a number of other countries. And we try to cooperate with those countries in dealing with those problems. But as we know, we continue to have those problems in the United States. There's not any easy way to eliminate them. I don't believe there is any evidence that the government of Haiti itself is engaged in this kind of activity.
Are we the cause of any of those problems?
Well, I think in the case of Haiti, in fact, that we had totally exaggerated views of what could be accomplished if we moved in our military and got rid of the military rulers at the time. And I think the country is in a serious difficulty. With respect to both of the last two callers, let me say, I think the issue isn't the timing of what the president did. I think the issue is the failure of policy over months and years that led to a situation where he had no alternative but to conduct a really very ineffective military action, the long-term consequences of which may even be harmful, I think. And there has to be debate about that. In fact, it comes a little strange from, I think, administration officials to say there's a tradition of not debating these issues. As a matter of fact, when President Bush made the decision to go to war in the Persian Gulf, he had a bare majority in the Congress supporting him in a very, very difficult debate going in. And I think we just have to live with the fact that some dictators are going to misinterpret that. But I come back, I mean, I think the fundamental point on Iraq is, to me, it was clear the day the Gulf War ended, and I think to most of our Arab allies it was clear the day the Gulf War ended, that as long as Saddam Hussein remained in power, he was going to be out essentially to win this war. From Saddam's point of view, Margaret Thatcher is gone, George Bush is gone, the president of Turkey is gone, most of the people who opposed him are gone, and he's going to outweigh the rest of them, and he is a very dangerous man.
Well, I think that the problem is there's no easy solution. If there was one, it would have been taken a long time ago. This problem really goes back to 1958, when the Ba'ath Party came to power in Iraq, overthrowing a Western government. There was then a lot of pressure on President Eisenhower to use American military force to restore a pro-Western government. He made the decision that he would not use American lives and American ground forces to undo that. The Bush administration made the same decision at the end of the Persian Gulf War. Those were two situations in which the use of military force would have been much easier than it is now. And I think we're living still with the consequences of that. And while I respect Mr. Wolfowitz's dissent, there is a great deal of disagreement in the foreign policy community as to whether or not there is a basis for seeking now to overthrow that government. There are no easy answers to that question, and I think it would be dangerous to assume that we could go into that without being willing to commit substantial amounts of American treasure and American lives to that enterprise.
Mr. Halperin, when did you first know that you wanted to be involved in the issue in the area of foreign affairs?
Well, when I was 12 years old and was reading the New York Times in Brooklyn.
You really did? I mean, you were sure then?
I was sure then.
Who was important in terms of impacting your thoughts on that? Not necessarily journalists, but I mean in terms of your family or someone...
Well, I think the Russians, or the Soviet Union, because it conspired with the North Koreans to invade Korea. And that was really my first introduction to international politics, was reading stories about the invasion of South Korea and the American decision to intervene in that. I followed those stories very closely and developed from that a lifelong interest in these issues.
What about you, Mr. Wolfowitz?
I guess it came a little later. I was a math and chemistry major at Cornell, but I was reading the newspaper more avidly every day than I was, I guess, doing math problems in my spare time, and I finally decided to take it up professionally. How
important is it when you go into the foreign affairs arena professionally to be involved in some of the organizations like the ones I see on your bio, Mr. Halperin, Council on Foreign Relations, Endowment, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, these types of organizations?
Well, I think every meeting you go to, you learn something new, and one of the great things about being in Washington is that every day there are 5 or 6 different groups that are convening some kind of colloquium on a foreign affairs issue. There's an enormous amount to know, and while I don't think anyone has any confidence that they have the right answers, these are issues where there's always 2 sides to the issue. I do think that knowledge is much more likely to produce a good result.
We get a lot of questions about the Council of Foreign Relations specifically. Are you a member, Mr. Wolfowitz?
Yes.
And you're a member also.
Yes.
What does it do?
Well, it's a membership organization that includes many of the people actively working on foreign affairs issues, both in the government and outside. It has a staff that I've actually been on, which does research on foreign policy issues. It also runs a number of meetings for its members, study groups, task forces of various kinds. And it is also a place where many foreign leaders who visit the United States come and speak. Its headquarters is in New York, but it now has a active Washington office as well.
How does it differ from, like, the Carnegie Endowment?
Well, the Carnegie Endowment is a grant-making organization that has money to give out to support projects. The Council on Foreign Relations is really more a kind of discussion society. There are, I think, some people out there with conspiratorial views of the Council on Foreign Relations. My experience of it, and I'm not that active a member, but the range of views within the Council on Foreign Relations is so wide that it couldn't possibly get together to agree on any single policy.
5 minutes left with our guest. Blanchard, Oklahoma is next on the Liberal Line. Good morning.
Good morning. I have 2 questions, if I might.
Go ahead.
Number one, I read a piece from a young man who allegedly had worked in the in this area, that the reason that we were sending satellite technology to China was because we could more monitor their movements and their progress. If we did that, their present setup, we can't monitor it. I don't know whether that's true. I've not heard anybody else talk about it. The other question is, I'd like for them to comment on that. The other question is, I didn't understand the former Bush administration gentleman there when he replied to the lady about sending jobs overseas. He insinuated that the menial jobs are going overseas and we're getting the better jobs, but in any country you're going to have people who need menial, low-paying jobs. There's going to be a variety of needs there, and what do we do with those people? And it seems that that's what's happening.
Mr. Wolfowitz, you want to take that?
First, on the business of monitoring, I don't think that any of the satellite sales we've made have seriously helped our intelligence capability with China. I think much more they've helped the Chinese in the technology area. I don't think you can take it job for job and say to do the accounting on the economics. I think the fact is we see an enormously strong American economy that's creating huge numbers of jobs for all Americans. That's why unemployment is at really record low levels. And I think you have to admit that that has gone along with a major growth in America's international trade. I think on balance, we do more in the way of job creation and high-quality job creation, and moving people up that job ladder from menial jobs to better jobs as they develop skills by being open to the world economy. But it's not without some losses, and I think one has to recognize that. And I think, in fact, when you're involved in foreign policy decisions, you do encounter cases where you say, this is an area where the United States has to protect a certain area, or at least make sure that the changes take place in a more gradual way so that people have time to adjust to them.
Mr. Halperin?
Yeah, I think we're in a period, the longest period of growth in the United States since the war, or the second longest. And I think part of it is the fact that the Congress and the President got together and balanced the budget, but I think an equally important part is the fact that we have been promoting a free trade regime. We didn't get to my other story, which was about bananas and the World Trade Organization, but we have been pressing very hard for a fair international trade system which enables us to sell our products abroad, and I think that is a large part of the explanation that we've been able to have this extraordinary growth with very, very low inflation and very low unemployment. If we shut ourselves off from the world trade, in the short run, a few jobs may be protected in a particular place, but the long-run impact will be very bad for our economy.
Last call for our two guests, New Brunswick, New Jersey, on the moderate line. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a question for each of one of your guests.
Go ahead.
The first one for Mr. Wolfowitz. He expressed seeing an Iraqi democracy. Is that in the best interest of the United States? What's the impact of Iraq democracy in the area? For the other guest, the estimation up to now is like $1 billion for the 4-day operation. That's from the newspapers. That's what I got. They used about 100 sites. That's about $10 million per site. The site, for the best estimates, doesn't cost $1 million. Is something wrong with those numbers, or the policy has to be targeted elsewhere?
And sir, I detect an accent in your voice. Where are you from?
Oh, I am originally from Algeria.
Mm-hmm. And when did you move to the United States?
1986.
Thank you for joining us. Mr. Halperin, you want to take the second part, your part first?
Well,
the dollars.
I think military operations are expensive, but I think we've learned we have to be prepared to use military force when it's required in pursuit of our interests, and pay the price for doing so.
Democracy in Iraq.
Look, one of the things about democracy is it's unpredictable, but in fact, we have seen a relatively democratic northern third of Iraq ever since President Bush sent, and I emphasize, a very small number of ground troops back into northern Iraq after the war ended, and the Kurds were able to get Saddam Hussein off their backs. They held the first real election, I think, in Iraqi history in 1992, and it was a relatively free one. And while it's not without problems, northern Iraq is a much better place today than it ever was under Saddam Hussein. I think the questioner may have in mind this notion that somehow if Iraq were more democratic, it would fly apart and this would destabilize the whole Middle East. I don't accept that. I think if Iraq were more democratic, it would have to be more decentralized. But the notion that we need a tyrant like Saddam Hussein who slaughters thousands of his people every year in order to keep that country whole, I think is nonsensical. I believe in the long run, democratic governments that therefore represent the interests of their people are more likely to represent the interests of the broad population in peaceful economic development, and less likely to engage in long, bloody wars like Saddam Hussein has.
Mr. Wolfowitz says, Dean, at Johns Hopkins, do you have a chance to do any writing?
Occasionally, but it's usually short pieces.
And where can people read you?
Well, my most recent article is in the New Republic. I've written in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times.
Any book that's still in print that they might be able to find?
No, longer pieces in Foreign Affairs and in the journal called The National Interest.
And what about you, Mr. Halperin?
Well, in my current position, I can only write things that go through a clearance process within the government. I've written a great deal before I went into the government.
Any books?
I have a book, actually, that's quite old, but still in print, called Bureaucratic Politics and Foreign Policy, published by the Brookings Institution, another one of these think tanks, which tries to explain the process by which the government goes about making national security policy.
On Christmas Day on this show, we're going to be talking about the whole issue of public speaking and who is your favorite public speaker. Both of our guests here in the Washington Journal today have appeared on C-SPAN in speeches that you've made throughout it, but who is your favorite public speaker?
Oh, I think I'll pass on that one.
You're not going to go out on a limb on that one,
No.
Mr. Halperin? What about you, Mr. Wolfowitz?
Living or dead?
It doesn't matter.
Oh, well, I think one has to take Lincoln and Churchill. They just are giants and incredible people to read. The hair stands up on the back of my neck when I read some of Churchill's speeches. I think it was John Kennedy who said that Winston Churchill mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. It was the force of his speeches that kept England in the war when it was all by itself. And we don't have anyone like him anymore.
We're going to be talking with some public speakers, also some people who coach public